The door to my lake cabin office exploded open with such force that the blinds rattled and a stack of papers I'd been reviewing scattered into the air like startled white birds. And before I could even push my chair back, HOA President Karen Levington, known to every resident for her bleached helmet of hair, permanently pursed lips, and a voice sharp enough to slice glass, marched inside as though she owned not just the cabin, but the entire shoreline, her stiletto heels stabbing at my hardwood floor in rapid-fire clicks that matched the fury blazing in her eyes. She was already mid-sentence when she crossed the threshold, her voice carrying that mix of outrage and entitlement that could make a saint grind their teeth. "I have told you, Mr. Caldwell, that your so-called private meetings in this cabin violate community transparency bylaws and this," she jabbed her manicured finger toward the mahogany desk between us, "is going to stop today or you'll be out of here before sunset." But her tirade faltered mid-breath as she realized there were other people in the room, and not just anyone, but a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark navy suit sitting casually in the leather chair opposite me, his hands clasped loosely. In his lap, his salt and pepper hair immaculately combed, his eyes calm but piercing like a hawk sizing up prey. Karen's gaze flicked to him, and her face drained of color so fast it was as if the lake wind had frozen her blood because she recognized him instantly. Governor Samuel R. Aldridge, the most powerful political figure in the state, the man whose face was on billboards, news broadcasts, and campaign posters everywhere, the man whose approval ratings made national headlines. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly for a moment before she stammered, "Governor?" as though speaking his title aloud might somehow make him vanish, but Aldridge only tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth curving into something between a polite smile and a predator's smirk, and said in a measured, velvety tone, "Mrs. Levington, I assume?" And in that instant, the air in the room shifted, the warmth from the fireplace seeming to recede as an invisible weight pressed down on all of us, because what Karen didn't know, and what I had no intention of telling her yet, was that the governor wasn't here for a friendly chat or a fishing trip. He was here for a meeting so sensitive, so dangerous to the balance of power in our little HOA-ridden lakeside community that if even one word of it leaked, it could set off a chain of events that would ruin careers, collapse property values, and possibly land several people, including Karen herself, in front of a grand jury. I could see her trying to recover, her mind scrambling for a way to regain the dominance she thought she had when she barged in. But every instinct told her she was out of her depth, like a yapping terrier realizing it had leapt into a pond full of alligators. I wasn't aware this meeting was with..." She trailed off, gesturing awkwardly toward the governor. But Aldridge leaned forward just enough that the light caught the subtle lapel pin on his jacket. A golden emblem I knew very few people had the clearance to even recognize, and said, "You weren't supposed to be aware, Mrs. Levington. In fact, you're not supposed to be here at all." The silence that followed was the kind that makes your ears ring, the kind that carries the weight of unspoken consequences, and I watched as Karen's fingers tightened around the strap of her designer handbag, her eyes darting between us like she was calculating whether to bolt for the door or double down on whatever crusade had brought her here in the first place. Outside, the wind gusted hard against the cabin, making the windows groan in their frames, and I realized the timing of her intrusion was more than just bad. It was catastrophic. This meeting had been set for weeks, arranged under layers of secrecy, with security measures that included an unmarked black SUV parked half a mile up the trail and a state trooper posing as a fisherman on the dock. And now here was Karen, HOA Karen, of all people, stomping into the middle of it like a grenade rolling across the floor. I caught Aldridge's eye for the briefest second, and in that silent exchange, I understood the gravity of the situation. She had seen too much already, and the question wasn't whether this would escalate. It was how quickly. Karen, still, clinging to the tattered remains of her authority, finally lifted her chin and said, "I don't care who you are, Governor or not. This property is under HOA jurisdiction, and if you think you can—" But she didn't get to finish because Aldridge stood, and when he stood, it was like the entire cabin shifted around him. He was taller than I remembered, his presence filling the room until it seemed there wasn't enough air left for anyone else to breathe, and he stepped around my desk with the slow, deliberate gait of someone used to controlling every room he entered, his polished shoes whispering against the floorboards as he closed the space between himself and Karen. "Mrs. Levington," he said, his voice still calm but threaded with a steel that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "This meeting concerns matters of state security, interstate commerce, and certain operations that your HOA has neither the jurisdiction nor the comprehension to interfere with." He stopped just a foot from her, close enough that she had to crane her neck to keep eye contact, and I could see the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat. "I suggest," he continued, "that you choose your next words very, very carefully." For the first time since I'd known her, Karen didn't have a comeback. She swallowed hard, and I swear I could hear it in the quiet. But then, because Karen was Karen, she tried to pivot, her voice quivering but defiant. "I still have a duty to the homeowners here. If there's something illegal happening on this property—" "Illegal?" Aldridge interrupted, his smile vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Mrs. Levington, if what we're discussing here were to be disclosed prematurely, the legality of it would be the least of your worries. Think bigger. Think stability of the region." He let the words hang there, heavy and opaque, before glancing at me. "Mr. Caldwell, perhaps it's time we invited Mrs. Levington to sit down." And that's when I realized what he meant by invited. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the kind of invitation you don't refuse. The kind that meant she was now, whether she liked it or not, part of something far larger than her petty HOA battles. Karen's knees bent just slightly, as though the invisible weight of the governor's words had pressed her down an inch closer to the floor, but she caught herself before she looked too shaken and slowly lowered herself into the leather armchair. Across from my desk, the one that had been unoccupied until seconds ago, though I noticed how her hands gripped the armrests with white-knuckled tension as if she needed the anchor. Aldridge didn't take his eyes off her as he returned to his seat opposite me, and I realized the way he sat now was different. Less casual, more like a general at a war council. The firelight flickered against his face, casting sharp shadows that made his features look even more chiseled and unreadable. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't to either of us in particular, but more as if he were speaking to the air, or to some invisible audience beyond the walls. "Do you know why?" "I'm here, Mrs. Levington." She hesitated, perhaps suspecting it was a trick question, and then said with forced bravado, "To discuss some private matter with Mr. Caldwell that you'd prefer the community not know about." Aldridge's gaze sharpened like the edge of a blade. "Private?" he repeated, his tone carrying the faintest echo of amusement. "Mrs. Levington, what's discussed here tonight will determine the fate of several $100 million in state contracts, the movement of critical infrastructure resources, and the prevention of an event that, if mishandled, could see every property around this lake and several miles beyond it reduced to ash." The words hung between us like live wires, and I saw Karen's fingers twitch slightly against the armrest, as though resisting the urge to reach for her phone. I knew what she was thinking. Record this? Call someone? Leverage it? But she wasn't reckless enough to try it with a man like Aldridge sitting in front of her. He went on, his voice measured and calm, but there was an undertone of urgency now, like a clock ticking beneath the surface. For the past 6 months, a consortium of developers, operating under the guise of your homeowners association, has been in negotiation with a private equity group headquartered offshore. They've been purchasing parcels of land around this lake, land that borders a critical transportation route. To the untrained eye, it looks like gentrification. To those paying attention, he let the pause linger until Karen leaned forward slightly despite herself. It looks like the first step in securing a logistical choke point. Control the lakefront, control the access routes, control the routes, control the movement of certain shipments. Karen blinked, the wheels clearly turning in her head. Shipments? She asked, her voice a notch quieter. Aldridge's gaze didn't waver. Let's just say they're not shipments you'd want near a residential area. He glanced at me then, a silent reminder of why I'd been looped into this meeting in the first place. I owned the cabin, but more importantly, I owned several undeveloped acres that sat right on the projected path of this so-called development plan. Karen tried to mask her confusion with indignation. That's absurd. The HOA doesn't control shipments. We manage community standards, enforce rules, and, Aldridge interrupted smoothly, approve or deny property use requests, grant access to certain docks, and control the maintenance of key access roads. Roads, I might add, that have been flagged by the Department of Transportation for upgrades that just happen to align perfectly with the timelines of these offshore investors. Karen opened her mouth to retort, but stopped as though the words had caught in her throat. I could tell she was replaying meetings in her mind, conversations she'd had with other board members, documents she'd signed without reading the fine print, perhaps even favors she'd agreed to without understanding the larger game at play. Aldridge leaned back, his voice softening just slightly, which somehow made it even more intimidating. Mrs. Levington, I'm not here to dismantle your HOA. I'm here because it's already been compromised. And unless we act tonight, your name will be the one on every paper trail linking this lakeside community to a scandal that will make national headlines. Karen shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me as though I might jump in to confirm or deny his claims, but I stayed silent. I knew better than to interrupt the governor when he was laying his cards on the table. Why tell me this? She asked finally, suspicion threading her voice. If you think I'm compromised, why not have me removed? Aldridge's smile returned, but this time it was colder. Because, Mrs. Levington, you're already in the room, which means you're already involved. Whether you like it or not, from this moment forward, you're part of the operation to stop this. Walking away isn't an option. Not for you, not for him. He nodded toward me, and I felt that same weight press down on my chest. And if I refuse? Karen asked, though her voice lacked conviction. Aldridge's answer was quiet, almost conversational. Then you'll have chosen a side, and it won't be mine. The fire popped loudly, making her flinch, and for the first time since she barged in, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Not just fear of losing control, but fear of something far more tangible, something she couldn't HOA vote her way out of. The storm outside had picked up, wind tearing across the lake in angry gusts that slapped against the cabin's walls and made the old timbers groan. The kind of weather that made most people retreat indoors with a mug of coffee and a blanket. But inside my office, the temperature felt like it had dropped 10 degrees in the last minute, not because of the weather, but because the governor had just outlined the first actionable step in whatever shadow operation we had apparently all been conscripted into. He pulled a slim black folder from inside his suit jacket and set it on my desk with deliberate precision. Sliding it toward Karen without breaking eye contact, the faint rasp of paper against polished wood loud in the silence. She hesitated, clearly torn between refusing outright and giving in to her curiosity, but in the end, curiosity won. Her hands, still slightly trembling, flipped the folder open, and I leaned forward to glimpse the contents. A series of aerial photographs of the lake's perimeter, taken at different times of day and marked with red X's, dotted lines, and handwritten notations in a tight slanted script I didn't recognize. One of the X's was directly over my undeveloped shoreline. Another sat right on the community dock, and several more were clustered near what looked like storage sheds at the far end of the marina. Beneath the photos were printed pages, financial, statements, shipping manifests, and what appeared to be email transcripts between certain HOA board members and names I'd never heard before. But the offshore domain addresses were enough to set off alarm bells. Karen's eyes flicked from page to page faster now, her breath quickening, the faint creak of the chair betraying how she was shifting uncomfortably as the scope of what she was seeing began to sink in. "These can't be real," she muttered, though it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself. Aldridge leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said, "They're real enough that 3 federal agencies have had eyes on this place for months. And as of tonight, Mrs. Levington, they're about to take action, unless we can give them a reason to hold off." Karen looked up sharply. "Hold off? Why would you want to hold off if this is as bad as you say?" Aldridge's mouth curved, slightly. "Because there's something bigger in play, something they don't know yet, something that could change the entire outcome if handled correctly." He reached into the folder and pulled out one last photograph, sliding it across the desk toward her. It was grainier than the others, clearly taken at night with a long lens, but the subject was unmistakable. A man in a dark coat and baseball cap stepping off a speedboat at the marina, flanked by 2 others, each carrying a long rectangular crate. Even in the poor light, the crates looked heavy, their contents obscured. "Who is that?" Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A problem," Aldridge said simply, "and one we can't solve without knowing who inside your HOA. Cleared their dock access last week." I saw Karen's jaw tighten as she connected the dots. Dock access approvals came directly from the HOA office, and only a handful of people had the authority to sign off. "You think it was me?" she said flatly. "I think," Aldridge replied evenly, "that you've been used, Mrs. Levington, and the people who used you are counting on you to keep playing your part without asking questions." He stood suddenly, the chair legs scraping against the floor, and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. "They're out there now," he said, almost to himself. "The boat just docked again. We have maybe 15 minutes before they move whatever's in those crates to the trucks." My pulse kicked up. "What do you need us to do?" I asked, the words out before I'd fully processed them. Aldridge turned back, his gaze sharp. "We're going to intercept them before they leave the marina. You know the trails better than anyone, Caldwell. You'll guide us in from the north side so we can avoid being seen from the main road. Mrs. Levington," he fixed her with a look that made her straighten in her chair. "You're going to get us past the locked gate at the maintenance yard. You still have your master keys?" She blinked, clearly stunned that she was being enlisted in what was sounding more and more like a covert raid. "Yes, but—" "Good. Bring them, and leave your phone here." She bristled. "Excuse me?" "Phones stay here," he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. "From the moment we leave this cabin, nothing we do is to be traceable." The weight of the moment settled in then. This wasn't a discussion anymore, it was a directive, and the governor was treating us less like concerned citizens and more like operatives in the middle of a classified mission. Karen hesitated, then set her phone down on the desk with a reluctant clack, her eyes flicking to mine as if to say, "What the hell have you gotten me into?" I didn't answer, just pulled on my jacket and reached for the flashlight I kept in the bottom drawer. Outside, the wind whipped harder, the trees along the shoreline swaying like dark sentinels, and as we stepped onto the porch, the sound of the lake was swallowed by the low hum of a boat engine in the distance. Aldridge moved with purposeful strides down the path toward the tree line, not looking back to see if we followed, and within moments, the cabin's warm glow was swallowed by the blackness of the forest. We moved in silence except for the crunch of gravel underfoot, the trail narrowing until it was little more than a deer path winding between the pines. Every so often, Aldridge would pause, scanning the darkness ahead, and I realized he was listening, not for the wind, but for anything that didn't belong. When we finally emerged near the ridge overlooking the marina, I could see the scene below lit by the harsh white glow of portable floodlights. The same speedboat from the photograph was tied to the dock, its hull slick with rain, and 3 figures were unloading more crates, stacking them near the waiting trucks. Karen's breath hitched beside me as she spotted the man from the photo. "That's—" she began, but Aldridge cut her off with a sharp gesture for silence. "Names can wait. We move in 2 minutes." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Karen looked pale, her eyes darting between the trucks, the crates, and the governor, clearly torn between self-preservation and whatever compulsion was keeping her from bolting. Aldridge crouched low, scanning the perimeter, then looked back at us. "When we get to the gate, you unlock it fast and keep moving. No stopping, no talking. Understood?" We both nodded. "Good," he said. "Let's go." And with that, we began the descent toward the marina, the wind carrying the faint sound of voices below, each step bringing us closer to whatever was inside those crates, and whatever storm we were about to walk straight into. The gravel under our boots shifted to the slick, compacted mud of the lower trail as we moved into the shadows behind the marina, the wind carrying the tang of diesel from the idling trucks. From this close, the crates looked even larger than they had in the photograph, and the men unloading them moved with the brisk, practiced rhythm of people who had done this before. Each lift and carry executed without wasted motion, no words exchanged, just the occasional flick of a hand or nod of a head. Aldridge halted us at the edge of the maintenance fence, crouching low and signaling for Karen to step forward, her master keys already in her trembling hand, the thin ring jingling faintly in the tense quiet. "The padlock," he whispered, pointing, and she moved toward it with careful steps, glancing over her shoulder once as if to confirm we were still there, then threading the correct key into the lock and turning it with a soft metallic click. That seemed deafening in the stillness. Aldridge eased the gate open just wide enough for us to slip through one by one, then swung it shut behind us without letting it latch. No need to trap ourselves in. From here, the floodlights were harsh enough to cast sharp-edged shadows across the wet asphalt, and I could see the faces of 2 of the men clearly now, neither local, their features hard and weathered, their eyes scanning occasionally toward the road as though they were expecting someone, but never toward the ridge where we had just been. Aldridge led us along the narrow strip of darkness at the edge of the fence line until we reached a stack of old, tarped equipment that offered cover. "Stay low," he murmured, then leaned out just far enough to get a better look, his jaw tightening as his gaze locked onto the man supervising the unloading, the same man from the nighttime photograph, now without a cap, his face fully visible under the lights, and the moment I saw him, I understood the governor's urgency. This wasn't just some smuggler or developer's enforcer. This was Victor Dragor, a name I'd only ever heard whispered in connection with things that happened far from polite company, a fixer for the kind of people who didn't leave loose ends, the kind of man whose presence anywhere near a residential lake was enough to guarantee trouble. Karen followed Aldridge's gaze, and her lips parted as if to speak, but before she could, a sudden metallic clatter echoed from somewhere near the docks, heads snapping toward the sound. One of the men shouted something I couldn't make out. Over the wind, and in the next breath, the tension that had been wound tight around the scene snapped. 2 more figures emerged from the shadows opposite us, moving fast and low, their own faces obscured, but their posture screaming military precision. They weren't part of Dragor's crew, that much was obvious, and Aldridge reacted instantly, motioning for us to stay put before stepping out from cover just enough to raise one hand in a subtle signal toward the newcomers. Whatever response he expected didn't come. Instead, Dragor barked an order, and suddenly the air was full of shouts, boots pounding on wet wood, the screech of metal against concrete as a crate slipped and crashed onto the dock, splitting open to reveal Rose. of tightly packed, unmarked metal canisters the size of fire extinguishers, their dull gray surface beading with rain. "Those aren't construction materials," Aldridge said under his breath, his voice tight. "We move! Now!" He started forward, and I grabbed Karen's arm to pull her with me, but she froze for half a heartbeat, her eyes locked on the canisters as if trying to process what she was seeing. That hesitation cost us. One of Dragor's men spotted movement in our direction, shouting and pointing, and in an instant the whole marina erupted into chaos. The trucks roared to life, backup lights flaring, men scattering to grab whatever they could from the dock, while the two unidentified figures from the far side closed in fast, weapons now visible in their hands. Aldridge shoved Karen toward the shadow of the storage sheds, his own hand going to the inside of his jacket where I knew a sidearm waited, though I'd never actually seen him draw it before. "Stay down," he ordered, and then he was gone, melting into the fray with a speed that didn't match his age, his dark suit disappearing into the shifting blur of rain, light, and motion. I crouched beside Karen behind a stack of rusted boat trailers, my pulse hammering so hard I could barely hear her whisper over it. "We have to get out of here." "Not without him," I said, scanning the scene for any sign of the governor. A sudden flash of movement caught my eye. Dragor shoving one of the canisters into the back of a truck before slamming the door shut and barking orders at his crew. The unknown operatives were closing in on him now, their paths intersecting in a collision of shouts, shoves, and the dull thud of fists against flesh. Karen flinched as a gunshot cracked through the air, the sound ricocheting off the water and sending a flock of gulls screaming into the night. I grabbed her wrist. "Move!" We sprinted along the back of the sheds toward the trail we'd come down, but halfway there, a figure stepped into our path, blocking the way, one of Dragor's men. His rain-slicked face twisted into a scowl, a crowbar clenched in his hand. "Going somewhere?" he growled, stepping closer, and for a split second I thought we were done. But then there was a blur of motion behind him, and the man crumpled sideways, Aldridge appearing in his place, breathing hard but still composed, a faint cut on his temple trailing blood down the side of his face. "Trail's hot," he said tersely. "We take the dock." "The dock?" Karen echoed, but he was already moving, forcing us to follow. The boards were slick underfoot, the water beneath churning against the pilings, and the speedboat Dragor had arrived on was still tied there, its engine idling. Aldridge vaulted in first, pulling Karen aboard after her initial protest, then motioned for me. I jumped, landing hard enough to make the hull rock. "Hold on!" he warned, then slammed the throttle forward, the boat lurching into the darkness. As shouts rose behind us and someone fired again, the bullet sparking against the railing inches from Karen's arm. The wind tore at my face as the shoreline blurred past, and for a long moment, the only sounds were the roar of the engine and the pounding of my own heartbeat. Finally, Aldridge eased off the throttle, steering us toward a narrow, unlit inlet. I hadn't been down in years. He killed the engine and let us drift into the shadow of overhanging pines, the sudden quiet almost disorienting. "They won't follow us here," he said, more to himself than to us. Karen sat rigid, rainwater dripping from her hair, her voice shaking as she asked, "What was in those canisters?" Aldridge looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Something that can't be here. Something that can't be anywhere, near civilians. And thanks to tonight, Dragor knows we know about it." He leaned back, running a hand over his face. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." The wind sighed through the trees, carrying the faint echo of the chaos we'd left behind. And I realized then that whatever lines had existed between our quiet lakeside life and the dangerous world beyond had been permanently erased. And that, whether she liked it or not, HOA Karen was now standing on the same side of that line as the governor and me.